The prison was never breached. It was already occupied. In March 2013, more than 60 federal agents in full riot gear surrounded a detention center in Baltimore, not to stop an escape, not to suppress a riot, but to reclaim something the state had quietly lost years earlier control. Inside, there were no alarms, no barricades, no resistance. Just a man sitting calmly on a steel bunk, eating better than most Americans holding a phone. He was never supposed to have completely unaware that the invisible kingdom he had built from a 6 by 10-foot cell was about to collapse. He wasn't a guard. He wasn't a warden. He wasn't elected or appointed. He was an inmate, and for years he had decided who lived safely, who got stabbed, who got protected, and which officers kept their jobs. Drugs flowed through the jail like inventory through a warehouse. Money moved silently through prepaid cards and coded transactions. Guards didn't enforce rules, they negotiated with him. Some loved him, some feared him, some carried his children. This wasn't a prison running badly. This was a prison running under different management. The state still owned the building, but it no longer held the power. And the most unsettling part wasn't that this happened, it was how long it went unnoticed. This is the story of how a single prisoner didn't escape incarceration, but instead turned a government facility into his own private empire, proving that when systems rot quietly, enough authority doesn't vanish. It gets replaced. By the time anyone noticed something was wrong, Baltimore City Detention Center had already stopped functioning as a jail. Opened in 1859, the facility was never meant to survive into the modern era, let alone house thousands of men shaped by contemporary gang culture, mass incarceration, and drug economies. Its bones belonged to another century, and its decay showed everywhere. Cells built for 2 men regularly held more. There was no air conditioning, ever meaning summers turned concrete tiers into ovens, with temperatures pushing well past what the human body could reasonably endure. In winter, heat failed without warning. Mold crept along walls. Rats learned the layout faster than new officers. Cameras broke and stayed broken. Supplies vanished. What remained was not order, but exhaustion. Correctional officers were stretched thin, underpaid, and asked to enforce control in a place that offered them none. Many earned less than supervisors at big box stores, yet were expected to manage violent offenders with minimal backup failing equipment and leadership that had quietly retreated behind office doors. The administration still existed, but authority did not. Decisions were delayed, responsibility was diluted, problems were negotiated instead of solved. In some cases, officials actually sat down with gang representatives to discuss stability, as if order could be crowdsourced from the very forces undermining it. This wasn't negligence born of malice. It was something worse: resignation. The system had accepted its own limits and adapted by lowering expectations rather than restoring control. Inside those walls, everyone felt it. Inmates sensed the absence of consequence. Guards sensed the absence of support. And in that vacuum, fear didn't explode into chaos, it condensed. It waited. Because when an institution stops believing in its own authority, it doesn't collapse all at once. It creates space. And space in places like this is never left empty for long. When Tavon White entered the Baltimore City Detention Center in 2009, nothing about him suggested inevitability. He wasn't famous, wasn't a legend, wasn't even particularly visible. On intake paperwork, he was just another stocky gang member from Baltimore streets, awaiting trial for attempted murder, facing a future that looked like decades of concrete and routine. But Tavon didn't arrive with a plan to rule anything. He arrived with something far more dangerous: the ability to read people, environments, and unspoken hierarchies. From his first weeks inside, he noticed what others took for granted. Violence wasn't constant, it was poorly managed. Gangs didn't lack power, they lacked coordination. Guards didn't lack authority on paper, they lacked the will and support to enforce it. The system wasn't oppressive, it was hollow. Tavon moved carefully, stepping into conflicts not to dominate, but to stabilize. When tempers flared in the chow line, he calmed them. When rival inmates squared off in showers or stairwells, he delayed bloodshed. Each intervention wasn't loud or theatrical, it was precise. Word spread quietly that situations resolved faster when Tavon was involved. Not because he was kind, but because outcomes became predictable. Predictability in a place built on fear is priceless. Tavon never announced himself as a leader. Others did it for him. Inmates began checking with him before acting. Disputes were run by Tavon. Violence stopped being impulsive and became conditional. He built authority not through constant intimidation, but through selective restraint, a balance that made crossing him unthinkable. Even guards noticed the shift. Certain tiers stayed calm. Certain problems disappeared before reports were written. In a facility where administration had surrendered to damage control, Tavon quietly assumed the role no one else was filling. He became judge, mediator, and final authority, not because the system endorsed him, but because the system left room for him. By the time anyone might have challenged his influence, it was already embedded into daily routine. Tavon wasn't leading a rebellion, he was replacing a function, and once inmates and staff alike adjusted to that reality, power stopped looking like force. It started looking like inevitability. Authority alone can stabilize chaos, but it cannot sustain it. Tavon White understood this instinctively. Control without reward breeds resentment and fear. Without benefit eventually turns inward. If his rule inside the jail was going to last, it needed more than discipline. It needed an economy. Contraband had always existed inside Baltimore City Detention Center, but before Tavon it was fragmented and small-time cigarettes traded here. A few pills slipped there, risky and inconsistent. Tavon saw something bigger. The jail held more than 2,000 men, many struggling with addiction, boredom, and desperation. Demand wasn't the problem. Structure was. Tavon imposed it. He didn't just allow contraband, he organized it. Prices became fixed. Supply became reliable. Access became conditional. If you wanted anything, cell phones, prescription opioids, anti-anxiety pills, tobacco razor blades, even home-cooked food, it flowed through one channel. His channel. A prepaid flip phone that cost $10 on the street sold for hundreds inside the walls. Pills that barely moved outside became priceless when withdrawal set in. Tavon wasn't gouging customers. He was exploiting inevitability. And no one could undercut him, because no one could operate without his permission. Violence enforced the monopoly, but rarely had to be used. The fear of losing access was enough. Money never changed hands in the jail. Cash was too obvious, too dangerous. Instead, Tavon built a financial system that mirrored legitimate businesses. Families on the outside loaded prepaid debit cards using numeric codes texted from within the jail. Funds moved cleanly from loved ones to intermediaries to suppliers, almost invisible to casual oversight. From a 6 by 10-foot cell, Tavon managed a revenue stream that outpaced what many officers earned in a year. The money changed everything. It bought loyalty. It bought silence. It bought insulation. Guards who were already struggling financially began to notice the gap between risk and reward. Tavon stopped behaving like an inmate and started behaving like management, allocating resources, reinvesting profits, paying taxes upward to gang leadership, and rewarding those who kept the operation smooth. Inside his cell, luxury quietly replaced punishment. Better food, better shoes, better treatment. The jail hadn't just lost control of contraband. It had lost control of incentive. Tavon didn't merely rule through fear or charisma. He ruled by replacing the system the jail failed to provide, proving that power doesn't survive on intimidation alone. It survives by making itself indispensable. The operation could have survived on fear and money alone, but Tavon White understood something. Most criminal enterprises never fully grasp. The most efficient way to control a system is not to overpower it, but to compromise the people meant to enforce it. At Baltimore City Detention Center, that vulnerability was everywhere. Nearly 3/4 of the correctional staff were women. Many young, many overworked, many earning wages that barely justified the risk of walking onto the tiers each day. They worked long shifts inside a decaying facility where backup was slow, cameras failed, and leadership felt distant. Safety, real safety, didn't come from policy manuals or supervisors. It came from whoever actually controlled the men behind the doors. Tavon positioned himself precisely there. He didn't start with bribes or threats. He started with calm. Housing units under his influence stayed quiet. Fights disappeared. Tension dropped. Guards noticed. In a job defined by constant stress, relief feels like loyalty. before it feels like danger. Conversations followed, compliments, small favors. Tavon framed himself not as a predator, but as a protector, subtly reversing the power dynamic. The inmate promised safety. The guard felt seen. Gifts appeared discreetly. Cash, designer items, eventually cars. Each step crossed a line, then normalized it. Professional distance dissolved into secrecy. Secrecy turned into dependency. By the time sexual relationships began, the structure of the jail was already compromised beyond repair. Guards smuggled contraband taped to their bodies hidden in uniforms, carried through entrances that were barely checked. They warned Tavon about upcoming searches. They influenced housing assignments. They moved enemies into segregation and allies into safe proximity. The keys no longer represented authority. They represented access. 4 officers became pregnant by Tavon while he was incarcerated. Some tattooed his name onto their skin, permanent declarations of loyalty to a man serving time. At that point, enforcement was no longer failing, it had inverted. The guards were no longer guarding the system. They were guarding him. When authority becomes intimate, rules stop feeling real. And once that happens, walls, locks, and procedures lose their meaning entirely. The jail didn't fall because it was attacked. It fell because the people holding it together quietly switched sides. No empire collapses because someone suddenly grows a conscience. It collapses because the margin for error disappears. By late 2012, Tavon White's confidence had hardened into something more dangerous than arrogance, certainty. He believed the system around him was too weak, too compromised, too entangled to ever turn against him. And for a long time he was right. But complex operations leave footprints, and the larger his control grew, the harder it became to hide the weight of it. A correctional officer's new car didn't match her salary. Contraband cell phones began appearing in numbers that suggested distribution, not coincidence. Money moved too cleanly too often. Somewhere outside the walls, patterns started to form. Federal investigators didn't rush in. They never do. They listened. Phones were tapped quietly. Financial records were reconstructed one transaction at a time. Associates on the outside were pressured, flipped, or watched until silence became cooperation. Inside the jail, Tavon felt untouchable. He stopped lowering his voice. He joked openly about his authority. He spoke as if power were permanent, as if the building itself answered to him. What he didn't realize was that every boast, every instruction, every casual phone call was documenting the very structure that protected him. The system he had built was no longer invisible. It was legible. By the time the decision was made, the operation didn't resemble a prison investigation. It resembled the takedown of an organized crime network. In April 2013, federal agents moved with precision. There was no chaos, no resistance, no dramatic standoff. Officers arriving for their shifts were met with handcuffs instead of keys. Cell blocks were locked down methodically. Tavon's network, so powerful in routine, was helpless in surprise. When the dust settled, the scale became undeniable. Dozens indicted, correctional officers exposed as co-conspirators, an entire wing of staff removed in a single morning. The myth of invincibility evaporated instantly. What had felt like absolute control was revealed for what it always was: borrowed time. Tavon had replaced a broken system, but he had never escaped it. And now the system he believed was incapable of acting had finally decided to remember itself. The final rupture didn't come from a verdict or a sentence. It came from a decision. When the empire collapsed and the evidence stacked higher than loyalty ever could, Tavon White chose survival. The man who had ruled through discipline, fear, and intimacy did what systems quietly reward. He cooperated. Behind closed doors, he agreed to testify, not vaguely or defensively, but in detail. He explained how the jail had been run, how guards were recruited, how money moved, how power worked when no one was watching. In court, his voice was calm, procedural, almost instructional. The women who had risked everything for him sat and listened as their private relationships were turned into exhibits, their affection reframed as conspiracy. Some would serve more time than the man who orchestrated it all. Dozens of convictions followed. Careers ended. Reputations collapsed. The detention center itself, a structure that had stood since the Civil War era, was permanently shut down in 2015, a silent acknowledgement that the problem wasn't just who ran it, but that it had been allowed to exist in that state at all. Reforms were announced, pay was raised, oversight tightened, promises were made. They arrived after the damage, not before it. Tavon's sentence ran concurrently with time he was already serving. He paid a price, but not one proportional to the power he once held. The story faded from headlines, but its implications did not. Because this was never just a crime story. It was a lesson in how authority erodes quietly, how systems fail without collapsing, and how control doesn't disappear when leadership retreats. It gets claimed, and when it does, it rarely looks like chaos. It looks like order, until the day the state has to come back and take it by force. This story isn't just about a corrupt inmate or a broken jail. It's a warning about what happens when systems grow tired. Oversight fades, and responsibility becomes optional. Power doesn't vanish when leadership steps back. It gets redistributed, often to the most ruthless and prepared. Whether in prisons, corporations, or communities, the lesson is the same: structure without accountability invites capture. If this story made you rethink how authority really works, hit like. If you believe others should hear this warning, share it. And if you want more deep investigations into hidden systems and real-world failures, subscribe, because the most dangerous breakdowns are the ones that happen quietly.